He stared at the crowd like a man facing a raging sea. Before him stood not reason, but a storm of screams and bloodlust. "Crucify him!" they cried. And even though he found no fault in that man, Pontius Pilate gave in. He washed his hands, but his soul, that he could never cleanse. How many times can one decision alter the course of an entire life? And how often does a public gesture attempt to hide the private desperation of a shattered heart? Pilate was no ordinary man. He was governor of Judea, a direct representative of Caesar himself, used to commanding legions, judging rebels, delivering justice with a cold blade. But when he stood before Jesus, he hesitated, because something in that gaze unsettled him. Something that made him feel small, exposed, bare, as if he, the Roman judge, was in fact the one being judged, in the presence of a higher power. This is one of the great biblical mysteries. What happened to Pontius Pilate after he handed Jesus over to death? The Bible ends his story there, with a bowl of water, washed hands, and a satisfied crowd. But often, the secrets of Scripture are hidden in its silences, and in this silence, deep echoes remain. Ancient writings, early church traditions, even fragmented historical records trace a dark path, a spiritual fate shaped not just by what Pilate did, but by what he refused to do. Pilate saw the truth standing before him and chose fear. Jesus' trial was public, exposed, soaked in blood, but Pilate's trial, it was slow, invisible, and far more cruel, because it unfolded within him day after day, night after night, until his final breath. He thought he had resolved a political issue, but in washing his hands, he plunged into a spiritual abyss and became forever part of sacred history as the man who tried to remain neutral before the cross. Which brings us to a far more unsettling question. Who was Pontius Pilate really? A cold-hearted villain, a coward under pressure, or a man torn between the fear of the crowd and the anguish of conscience? This video will offer more than historical answers. It will lead you on a path of revelation, a journey blending facts, traditions, and spiritual conflict that still echoes today in hearts that, like Pilate's, find themselves face to face with the truth and hesitate. Because the body of Jesus was taken down from the cross that day, but Pilate's soul began to carry an invisible cross that neither Rome, nor Caesar, nor time itself could ever take away. The stone halls of the palace felt colder that morning. The sun was rising over Jerusalem, but within Pilate there were only shadows. The case was closed, the leaders were satisfied, the people had calmed, but he had not. There was something strange about that crucifixion. Something that disturbed him more than any sentence he had ever delivered. And it was more than guilt. It was a presence, as if that man's gaze was still following him. For years, Pilate had passed judgment without hesitation. Rebels, thieves, agitators, all received their verdict under the full weight of the law. But now, something inside him felt as though it was being judged, and he didn't know by whom. He returned to his former life, official duties, reports sent to Rome, meetings with the local priests. But everything felt hollow, as if part of him had been left behind on the stone of Golgotha. At night, the echoes of the crowd's cry still rang in his ears. But what haunted him most was the silence of the one he had sentenced to death. Jesus did not beg. He did not defend himself. He simply looked at him, as if he knew that Pilate held no real power. The guards began whispering. Rumors of an empty tomb, followers claiming he had risen. Pilate ordered the rumors silenced, called it peasant superstition, but inside, he trembled. He no longer knew if he had executed a man or betrayed heaven itself. For weeks he tried to regain control, organized ceremonies, welcomed ambassadors, but he no longer felt whole. And when night fell, he dreamed of blood on his hands, of a crown of thorns, of a gaze that pierced his soul like a sharp blade. When a story confronts us with the truth, it's not just meant to be heard, it's meant to be answered. So, if this journey is stirring something in your soul, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this message with someone who needs to awaken to the voice of conscience. Because silencing the truth has never saved anyone, and there are stories in the Bible that were never meant to inform, but to transform. The Roman Empire marched on. But inside the palace of Caesarea, a powerful man was trying to quiet something that refused to be silenced. And that's when he made his second mistake. He ordered all traces of the case erased. Records were destroyed, rumors ignored. He tightened control over Jesus' followers. He believed that if the name disappeared, peace would return. But peace was never in his hands. Ancient accounts, preserved in early Christian tradition, say that Pilate began to avoid crowds, that he spoke to himself, that his wife, the one who dreamed and tried to warn him, would find him waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and whispering unintelligible things. It was as if the palace had become an invisible courtroom, where he stood trial every night, accused by a voice no one else could hear. And this is where the biblical mystery begins to take shape. The trial of Jesus was only the surface. The true drama unfolded later, hidden in the heart of the man who condemned him. History moves in silence, and while the followers of Christ grew in boldness, the man who had the power to free him now lived imprisoned, not by iron bars, but by a burden no Roman decree could lift. And while everything seemed under control to human eyes, heaven was already preparing to write the next sentence, not against Jesus, but against the one who gave him up. The sun no longer shone as brightly in Caesarea. The palace columns still stood tall and imposing, but Pilate's soul wavered like a candle flickering in the wind. Days passed. The name of Jesus, the one he had tried to bury along with the body, kept resurfacing in whispers among the guards, murmurs in the streets, soldiers saying they had heard that he was alive. Pilate thought his actions had closed the chapter of a religious disturbance, but he realized, far too late, that he had touched something eternal. He hadn't crushed a rebellion. He had disturbed a biblical mystery far beyond anything Roman power could grasp. So he wrote to Rome, formal letters packed with political justifications. He explained that he had tried to avoid riots, that he yielded to the priests out of administrative caution. But there was something in his words that betrayed his inattention. It wasn't just fear of the emperor. It ran deeper, a fear that perhaps he was trying to justify himself not to Caesar, but to God. History hasn't preserved the full content of those letters, but ancient sources suggest that Tiberius Caesar was not pleased. To him, Pilate had lost control of the province, bowed to local pressure, and above all, allowed rumors to grow around a supposed Son of God. Rome had no issue with local religions, but it would not tolerate symbols that could threaten its authority. And now that name, Jesus of Nazareth, was being whispered not only in Jerusalem, but among the Roman soldiers themselves. Pilate watched from a distance, but within, he felt something closing in. It wasn't just human judgment he feared. It was the reckoning for a decision that could no longer be undone. As the rumors spread, Pilate became a political liability, no longer seen as competent. His name was now associated with instability, the shame of having bowed to local leaders. But what troubled the empire most was that the crucifixion of that man hadn't silenced his followers. It had ignited something uncontrollable. Small groups began to appear, speaking of him as if he were alive. Reports of fishermen turned preachers, of miracles, of appearances, of a faith that would not be shaken by the steel of the legions. Pilate saw the mistake, but it was too late. According to early Christian tradition, he lived in constant tension, questioned soldiers, interrogated messengers, ordered disciples to be watched. But what tormented him most was something no soldier could arrest: the memory. Jesus' face wouldn't leave his mind. Not the blood, not the pain, but the eyes. Eyes that didn't accuse, but knew him. And that was the harshest judgment of all, to realize that the one he had condemned knew everything about him. Tiberius, according to some ancient records, ordered an investigation into Pilate. Others claim he ordered his removal from office. But the truth is, even without an official decree, Pilate's fate was already sealed. He was falling, and not even Rome could stop it, because it wasn't power he had lost, it was peace. Meanwhile, the name of Jesus spread like fire through dry grass. Priests couldn't contain it, courts couldn't ban it, Pilate couldn't forget it. And then he began to suspect everything. His friends, his scribes, even his wife. They said she had grown distant, quiet, that she prayed alone at night. Something was changing in her, and that frightened him more than any threat from Tiberius. He, who once held power over life and death, now lived as a prisoner of a name he had tried to erase, but that, like a searing brand, burned stronger and deeper inside him. And as Rome moved forward like a great iron machine, Pilate walked alone toward a place where power holds no sway and titles have no meaning, the tribunal of the soul. The decree arrived without ceremony. Pontius Pilate was officially removed from office. Rome offered no public explanation, only the name of his replacement and orders to leave Judea. The letter was short, dry, bureaucratic, but between its lines lay the weight of irreversible humiliation. His fall was not merely political, it was spiritual, and perhaps in that moment he finally understood, you do not turn your back on the truth without consequence. The man who once washed his hands before the crowd now walked toward obscurity, no longer as governor, but as an exile, defeated by history and by his own conscience. He was sent north, according to ancient traditions, to a region far removed from Rome's glory. Some accounts point to Vienne, in Gaul, others to the mountainous regions of Roman Switzerland. The geography matters little, because Pilate's true exile was not from Rome. It was from peace. Without the palace, without soldiers, without the crowds, all that remained was silence. His wife went with him, but she had changed. She was more reserved, more observant. Many say she converted to the faith of the one she had tried to save. Others say she lived in constant prayer, withdrawn from her husband. But between them, silence grew, like an invisible wall. Pilate began to avoid mirrors. He could not bear his own reflection. In that worn face, he saw a judge who had not judged righteously. A man who had the chance to free the innocent and chose the comfort of office instead. Some nights he would startle awake, whispering phrases in Aramaic he barely understood. He had visions of a man with eyes like fire, of a crowd in flames, of a voice saying, "What have you done with the truth?" Little by little he began to walk alone through the hills, avoided conversation, averted eyes, carried a piece of wood in his hand. Some said it was merely a walking staff. Others believed it symbolized the burden he could never lay down. Eastern tradition says Pilate became a shadow. He wandered among the trees, speaking to himself, repeated phrases from the trial, murmured lines from his conversation with Jesus. From time to time he would ask aloud, "What is truth?" But now no one answered. Rome had forgotten him. Jerusalem despised him. His wife prayed, and he wandered. To some, he went mad. To others, he repented. Certain ancient traditions, especially among Ethiopian and Coptic Christians, believe Pilate came to recognize his failure and wept. He did not weep for fear of hell, but because he understood far too late what it meant to stand before the Lamb and choose the crowd. The conscience, the ancients say, is a harsher tribunal than any Roman court, because in it the judge and the accused live in the same heart. In Gaul, they say the locals saw him as a disturbed man. He would sit by springs, speak to the wind, always seemed to be waiting for someone who never came. Once, a child said she saw Pilate staring at the sky and asking, "Does he still see me?" No answer was ever heard, but perhaps the silence was the answer. Other accounts say he died there alone, consumed by visions and sorrow. Some claim he took his own life, a final act of despair and anguish. Others say he withdrew to a cave where he spent his last days in prayer. No one knows for certain, and perhaps we never will. But one thing is clear, the man who washed his hands ended up drowning within. And still, even in the ruins of his soul, there remains a strange whisper, an almost unbearable possibility. What if in the end he understood? What if somewhere in the silence he heard something no earthly court could say? Because even when the world abandons, the grace of God still whispers, even in exile, in shame, in silence. Redemption is still offered. But for that, one must first admit the wrong. And Pilate, he saw the truth face to face. The only question that remains is, did he embrace it in the end, or remain neutral to his final breath? The silence that surrounded Pilate's final days did not mark the end of his story. On the contrary, that's when it began to echo even louder. As the empire carried on, as Caesar died and new emperors rose, the name of Pontius Pilate did not vanish. It became a symbol, a warning, a legend. The Bible's sacred silences often leave gaps, and tradition fills them with awe and reverence. And so for centuries, Pilate's fate has been told not as historical data, but as spiritual warning. In Ethiopia, for example, where Christianity flourished powerfully from its earliest centuries, there exists a bold tradition. Pilate repented and was forgiven by God. In this view, he recognized the holiness of Jesus and, before death, surrendered his soul to the Lord. That belief is so strong that to this day, in certain liturgies of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Pilate is mentioned with respect. He, the man who gave in to the crowd, had wept. He had come to understand, not with the eyes of politics, but with the eyes of the Spirit. But not all traditions have shown such mercy. In the West, Pilate became a symbol of coldness, a figure remembered in creeds only as the one who sentenced Jesus. His memory steeped in guilt, neutrality, and omission. Across the centuries, strange apocryphal texts emerged. Some claim Pilate was tormented by visions even after death, that his soul wandered, never at rest, always washing his hands in a river that never ran dry. That night after night, he heard the echo of his own voice. I find no fault in this man. Others speak of ghostly appearances, of monks in prayer glimpsing a lone figure in the distance, of dreams in which a man in a Roman robe cried out for forgiveness, surrounded by shadows. No one spoke his name, but the eyes were always the same. The eyes that once looked into Jesus and failed. How much truth lies in these legends? We don't know. But what they reveal matters more than the facts themselves. They show that once the human conscience is touched by eternity, it cannot forget. And here lies the deepest truth of all. Pilate is still being judged, not by earthly courts, but by the soul of everyone who hears his story. Because deep down, he represents something far greater, the inner conflict of every person who once stood before the truth and chose silence, all who favored the crowd, the politics, the comfort, instead of the cross. Pilate lives in the church's memory. He stands in the symbols of the faith. He appears in the Gospels as a key figure in the Passion of Christ. But above all, he lives in each of us who, when faced with Jesus, choose to wash our hand. And still, within the shadows of these legends, a question whispers without rest. Can someone who betrayed the Son of God still be reached by grace? The answer isn't found in history. It's found in eternity, and maybe in the next breath, in the final tear, in the silent prayer that only heaven heard. Pilate said what no record ever wrote. She appears like a whisper amid the uproar. Between the crack of whips, the accusations of the religious leaders, and the governor's wavering one woman dreams. And in that dream, she sees something the Bible never describes, but it makes her tremble. Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Matthew 27:19. She was the wife of Pontius Pilate, and in that moment she became the only voice trying to stop the cross from rising that day. Her name is never mentioned, Her appearance is never described, but her spiritual sensitivity was recorded for all eternity. While the court debated politics, while Pilate weighed power against convenience, she received a message from above, touched by something that defied logic. She suffered in her dream and in her soul, and with urgency she sent word, "That man is righteous." But Pilate ignored her. Too many other voices surrounded him, the crowd, the Pharisees, the soldiers, and like so many men when faced with truth, he chose noise over conscience. Of all the divine interventions during the crucifixion story, this was the most discreet and perhaps the most personal. God tried to reach Pilate through the one person he might still have heard with his heart, his wife. But the warning fell into silence. She is never mentioned again, but history left a trace. Ancient traditions say she converted, that she took refuge in prayer, that she wept for him more than for herself, and that she lived remembering the day God spoke and no one listened. This woman represents all those who receive glimpses of the divine but are dismissed, who see the truth before others but cannot stop the fall of those they love. But she was faithful, she spoke, and because of that her name, though never written, is inscribed in the pages of heaven. Before the cross there was a dream, before the nail a revelation, before the fall a chance. And even though she was ignored, she proved that God did not leave Pilate alone. He washed his hands, but he didn't wash his soul. The story of Pontius Pilate doesn't end with his death. It lives on every time someone, faced with the truth, chooses silence. Sooner or later, every human being sits in the seat of judgment, not to judge others, but to decide what they will do with Jesus. You can hide behind fear, the crowd, or comfort. You might even try to stay neutral, but before the cross, there is no neutrality. Pilate saw the truth face to face. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse, it simply looked. And that look still pierces through the centuries and finds you. What have you done with the truth that confronts you? Because in the end, Pilate wasn't condemned for his mistakes, but for his omission. And that is the hardest guilt to bear, to know what is right and not choose it. If this story stirred your conscience, write in the comments what it awakened in your heart. Sometimes a single sentence from you can reach someone else living in the same silence. And if you value content that inspires faith, courage, and discernment, don't forget to leave a like. That tells YouTube there are still people out there searching for truth without filters. And make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because here, every biblical story is told as it truly is, alive, stirring, and impossible to ignore. And don't forget to share this message with someone who needs to wake up to the voice of conscience, because silencing the truth has never saved anyone.